Welcome. I'm so excited to talk to you today because I checked your website and there is so much information, and I think it's one of my favorite websites ever. I have never seen anything as clean, as like categorized. Everything is just very user friendly, and yeah, my favorite website. I think. Have you written a book, by the way?
No, I haven't, and thank you for inviting me. Um,
Yeah, you're welcome.
I have not written a book. It is an idea that's kind of sitting in the works. Um, the first, see, we dropped out there for a moment. Yeah, so that's an idea that's in the works for the future.
Yeah, because when I saw all the articles, I thought that, wow, you could just put them in one together. There's so much valuable information
Hmm.
there.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah,
You have done a
that was.
lot of work.
It's been going on for quite a few years.
Yeah.
Um, I was reading this material for a decade and a half, I guess, before I started publishing it.
Mm,
So yeah, it's been quite a long journey.
right. So what really got you interested in this topic?
This goes back to 9/11. Um, I think that was the trigger for me because before that time I didn't really pay much attention to what was going on in the world around me. But that particular event started me asking some more questions. So that led down a very winding path over the years and has eventually brought us to this point where yeah, it's very much focused now on cataclysm law and the evidence for previous events of that sort of type.
Right.
So yeah.
So let's get started with like theories about cyclical cataclysms, or
Hmm.
maybe they're not cyclical, but about cataclysms that seem to happen on our planet. I think one of the classic ones is the 90-degree tilt one, where magnetic
Absolutely.
poles shift, not
Hmm. Hmm.
the magnetic ones, but the poles themselves, they
Yes,
shift
the
to
actual
90 degrees.
geographic pole shift.
Mhm,
Yes.
mhm.
Okay, so the two are connected, I believe. But yeah, let's start with where that came from. So there have been a number of authors for the last few hundred years that have proposed the possibility that the Earth's geographic poles have shifted their location. And I think if we can just pull up the first slide here, I think one of the earliest mentions of the rotations of the Earth was Cuvier in the 1800s, where he spoke of the revolutions of the Earth, and he was immediately looking at the geological evidence, and but he didn't obviously specify at that point that it was 90 degrees. The first time that appears, I think, was in 1953 when Chan Thomas published the Adam and Eve story, which I think quite a few of the audience to this will probably have come across by now. And therein he described very specifically that it appeared that it was around about a 90-degree turn. But that's not where he got it from. We're going to go forward a little bit further in time. We'll come back to where all of these authors, I believe, got this idea. 1958, Charles Hapgood, another very well-known book, is Shifting Crust. And here, this is the first time I think we see in print the idea that it was the off-center mass of Antarctica's ice that would tug that mass towards the equator if there was a decoupling between, he believed, between the crust and the mantle. So, as you can see, Albert Einstein contributed a foreword to this particular book, and Einstein expressed his reservation that he didn't think that there was sufficient force available to decouple the crust from the mantle. Too much friction, basically. So we're looking at the ice mass as really the origin of the 90 degrees, because the idea is that that massive ice, once it comes loose, will pull itself towards the equator under centrifugal force. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Next in the line was Hapgood's next book, The Path of the Pole, so a few years later. And here, and once again, he addressed the 90 degrees, which we can see here. And interestingly, as you can see on this map as well, Hapgood marked the locations of the alternate poles where he thought they would be. And we'll come back to why this is quite significant a little bit later on. Now, where did all of these authors get their ideas from? I believe that they were aware of Project Nanook, which, even though this book was only published in the 90s, Nanook was actually this project, which Ben mentioned as well when he spoke with you, was carried out in the 1940s. It was an exploration of the pole by the US military to try and establish better navigational methods. And it seems that this is where Chan Thomas probably got his idea. I think he was aware of this particular work before it ever came out in print, and that's why Chan Thomas never ever actually cited this as a source, or never cited Nanook as a source, because it was still a state secret at the time. And I'm pretty sure he would have been prosecuted if he had come out and said, hey, I'm divulging classified information. Yeah, so I think that pretty much sums up where I think the origin of the 90 degrees came from. These are,
Can we go a little bit deeper on this specific book, Ken White's book?
yes, for sure. So
What it's
this isn't,
about?
it's an interesting book because it was actually written by, Ken was the son of Colonel of, I think it was Major White. I've forgotten his first name. So he wrote his father's account of his experiences up in the Arctic, and the 46th was a reconnaissance group that was sent to the Arctic after the Second World War to try and map the region for the purposes of navigation. Their concern was that if the Russians at the time managed to achieve navigation of the poles before them, it would be a threat, which it clearly would be. And at that time, it was extremely difficult to navigate in these regions because magnetic compasses didn't work. There was no such thing as GPS, and they had to come up with a way to do it. So these pilots were basically flying by the stars to try and find their way around up there. But as a side of what they were of their explorations, they observed that the magnetic North Pole had migrated by an enormous distance since the last time it had been measured. It was a few hundred miles, if I remember, which was a great surprise because up until that time it had been moving relatively slowly, and that led them to explore this a little bit deeper and came back with a report that it appeared that the Earth had actually shifted its orientation a number of times in the past. And they had meetings. This is according to what is written in the book. There were meetings held to decide whether to release this information to the public. And initially, the decision was no. And then thereafter, they said, well, but let's put it out there anyway. And it did actually appear in a few, I think it was probably popular science articles of the time. And as so often happens, nobody really took any notice. So that is the history of that, I think. Most of the book is actually relating other experiences. There's only a couple of chapters in it that address this particular topic. The vast majority of the book was just covering the day-to-day events and explorations that they were undergoing and just how tough it was to operate in that environment.
So how did so then you think that Chan Thomas he knew about this mission to the Antarctica?
Definitely. Chan was he was working for the U.S. government. Pardon me. He was working for the U.S. government during those years, during his early years. Much of it on classified projects. So it does seem that he was very likely party to this information before it
Mm.
ever became public.
So the 90-degree tilt is mainly based on the ice, the
On the
centrifugal
ice
force.
in Antarctica, yes,
And
yes,
there has been
correct.
simulations done in modern times. Have you heard about that?
Not
There were
not that I'm aware of. Um, yeah, they don't seem to be. Yeah, I mean, the concept is fairly straightforward. We have a growing mass of ice, an anomalous mass, which is which is increasing and decreasing at various times in various parts of the world. And clearly, the largest one of these is Antarctica. So, as with a spinning object, as it spins, it wants to spin as widely as it can, centrifugal force pulling itself outwards. And the idea is that this additional mass on the Earth, if it were to come loose, would pull itself immediately towards the equator. And and in all of these books that we've just mentioned, the assumption was that this would be quite rapid. It would happen in a matter of hours or days, which
Mhm.
would be catastrophic. Obviously, that would involve the migration of all of the oceans across the land as it relocated itself and realigned itself. And that
And
explains a great deal of what we see, you know, the mammoths and other animals that are buried in various locations that they shouldn't have been. What were mammoths doing near the Arctic? That suggests that there was green food available to them there.
mm.
Mm.
The another hypothesis that was put forward by ethical skeptic is ECDO hypothesis. What do you think about that one?
Yes, that's my favorite.
Really?
And
Why?
I say so because um, I had already encountered all of his other works before I saw Tez's work, and the thing was none of the others provided sufficient specificity about what the movement was, and Tez locked onto the pyramid, the design of the pyramid. I don't know if you would like to bring that slide up. We will start with the interior, and it was Tez's observation that, first of all, that the pyramid appears to be situated on the Earth's center of mass, center of land mass, which is quite a unique position, and that the interior design had this 104-degree angle repeated within it, both within the air shafts from what we call the King's Chamber and in the copper cables that were laid from the Queen's Chamber. Now, the idea that the northern shaft is pointed towards the Earth's geographic North Pole, where we currently see the North Pole star, is suggestive that the other one may have had a similar purpose. And the problem was, how could the other shaft possibly work unless the pyramid changed its relative position to the Earth's rotation? So Tez has theorized that in the second position, after the Earth has rotated, this in the second position, the other shaft would line up, and from this we derive the 104 degrees. And this was an absolute key because now we had a very specific degree of movement to look at.
Sorry,
So,
I have to
mm,
ask a question here.
mm,
So mm, the one the the right one, the current north celestial pole, that's
yes,
actually the geographic pole currently that is
yes,
our geograph. And then the left
correct.
one is the one that is supposed to be at after the shift.
After the shift, yes.
Mm-hmm.
So the pyramid in this model migrates all the way across the Arctic to the other side and winds up with the other shaft now pointing towards the North Celestial Pole. And
Does
in that
that mean?
way,
Mm-hmm.
I was going to say, in that way, the pyramid provides an observatory to monitor for destabilization of the Earth's rotation in anticipation of this event in both directions. So by
Sorry, I didn't get
observing, okay, so if we were to imagine we're sighting towards the pole star, the current pole star, the North Celestial Pole, as the Earth wobbles or begins to destabilize, so that star would move out of the view of the observatory through
that.
on
Yeah.
this line.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be an indication that things are starting to get a little bit unsettled.
Oh, so it's
And
like
that would
a prediction, sort of. It's like okay, so yeah, observation
not
to make
not not necessarily predictive, but definitely kind of like an alarm system, a
preparation. Yes,
warning, a
alarm system.
warning, yes.
Mm,
And,
okay.
and that's quite a key point because I feel that the design of the pyramid, if Tez is correct on this, which I think he is, that the pyramid was not intended to be a predictive mechanism, but rather a warning system. I don't think they knew exactly when it was going to happen, and the mere fact of this design supports that. They built this because they didn't know exactly when it was going to happen, but they needed to watch for when it was about to.
But they knew that when the North Pole is gonna appear in that specific location, that's when it's gonna happen. Interesting. But why
Absolutely.
do you think that's the indication?
I'm sorry, that broke up. Why do I think?
Why do you think that's the indication that it's gonna happen?
Well, the Earth's rotation is a bit of an unsettled thing. It doesn't rotate very smoothly. It has a number of wobbles, the Chandler wobble and nutation, which are these tiny little disturbances which are semi-regular in the Earth's normal rotation. And we know and believe that some of this is attributed to the gravitational effects of the moon as it moves around the Earth and the gravitational effects of the sun, and almost certainly the effects of the larger planets as well, I'm sure. So, in with all of these external forces tugging upon the Earth as it moves and rotates, there are it's not an entirely static system. There's a lot of dynamic activity going on, and it seems very likely that there are times when that destabilization becomes so severe that the energy has to be dissipated, and that occurs as what we identify today as Dzhanibekov oscillation.
Oscillation.
Yes. I have a few little videos of that here. We can pull up various versions of it. So this is the original version. Let's see if it'll play. This was from the original Russian videos that were published, where they interviewed Dzhanibekov, illustrating what he had observed in space when quite literally he had spun a wing nut off of its bolt, and the wing nut started to obviously spin in 0 G and then suddenly flipped over 180 degrees, and then repeated this back and forth and back and forth. And this is a characteristic of any unbalanced, pardon me, on any unbalanced rotating object, in even in gravity. Here's another example. This is done in a laboratory on Earth. Let's see if this will play. Here we go. Okay, so this gyroscope, which is encased in probably in resin, is being floated on a cushion of air. And you'll notice that the gyroscope has one axis which is thicker than the other. It's heavier on the top than it is on the bottom. And as it spins, this results in destabilization, which resolves itself by flipping over. Now, the reason why the Earth doesn't seem to necessarily flip all the way over is because of that ice mass, I think. It's the ice
Oh,
mass which restrains it to the equator. It gets halfway there and then
mm,
probably spends
wobbles
some
back.
time in that location, and then we wobble back to our natural orientation. Yes, here's another
Okay.
example which I'm sure others have seen. I posted where this gyroscope has been unbalanced. It's not perfectly balanced. There's a slight bit of mass being removed or added to one axis, and as we can see, it traces a widening destabilization and then flips and then returns back again. And this is a very accelerated version of what I think we see in the Earth.
So what is causing that wobble? Destabilization wobble?
It's the fact that the Earth is not perfectly balanced. It has
Mm,
the Earth has a lot of mobile mass on it, where most of it is water, the mobile mass, and when it attaches itself to the land in the form of land-based ice, that becomes an anomalous mass. So by over most of the time, the Earth is rotating on its stable axis, and then we get this buildup of mass going on in various
mm,
places, which
hmm.
starts tugging at it, pulling at it, destabilizing it.
Okay.
And when we couple this with interesting choice of word, when we consider Tez's idea that we're dealing with a flux of heat that comes not from above but from within the Earth, and at various periods, the Earth's core, the outer core, releases great amounts of heat, which actually results in a decoupling not between the crust and the mantle, but between the outer core and the mantle, which is largely held in place, we think, by magnetic force. There's obviously a certain amount of friction involved, but there's a lot of liquid down there as well. So it seems that the magnetic force is what keeps everything locked together. And as the Earth's magnetic field weakens as well, this also leads to a potential state where that outer core and the mantle can come loose from one another. And that is probably the trigger that allows the ice mass to pull itself towards the equator. It's no longer
So
being stabilized by the full mass of the entire Earth.
so what Thomas Chan described, that the what keeps them together becoming liquid is correct. That stands.
Yeah, well, Chan did speak on this. He spoke about magnetohydrodynamics and specifically how magnetic forces and interacted with the liquid core of the Earth, and very likely had something to do with this. He was very close. He
Mm.
was very close.
Okay, so then I guess the Earth always spins and wobbles like that all the time, but just because of the magnetic field becoming weak in that specific moment, that becomes melts. Is it, what's the correct
Yes,
word? Becomes liquid and then is not attached anymore, and then that's when the shift happens.
it does seem to be part of the process, yes. So we have a combination of heat rising from below, and this heat takes time to reach the surface. So the effects that we see on the surface may be delayed by hundreds of thousands or millions of years. And I believe that comes out, that these heat fluxes from the core eventually reach the surface as enormous volcanic activity,
Mm,
which we see in various places around the world. There are these massive fields of lava which were just basically poured out of the earth and now cover hundreds of thousands of kilometers, millions of square kilometers in various
yeah.
places.
I think like it's we don't really think about it, but I think the outer core reaches the heat of 5,500 Celsius
Yes,
degrees or
around
something
about
like
the
that. Or
temperature of
what?
the sun. Yes, yes,
We're
correct.
literally on. inside the Earth, there's such a high temperature that we can't even think about because we're on the surface. It's what, like right now, it's 20 degrees Celsius, and right
Yes,
there inside, it's
yes,
5,000 degrees Celsius. Yeah.
yes. And this, I think, has a this is where a lot of the deception, I will call it, around climate change is coming from. A lot of this heat that is being attributed to our activity is actually rising from below. One example that comes to mind immediately are the explosive outbursts we see in the permafrost, where these giant potholes are being seen more and more often, and melting of the permafrost from below. It wouldn't explode if it was being heated from above. The heat must be coming from below to cause that
Mm.
to happen.
Hmm.
And we're seeing this also in the heating of the oceans. So I think this particular evidence has never been included in any climate model. Tez has mentioned this. It's simply not factored in, so the models don't work because they do not account for heat from below.
Hmm. And what do you think about the theory that the Earth doesn't tilt, but because of the weak magnetic field, they're going to be that the what the myths and the ancient texts mentioned, the flood, the Noah's flood, all that is because of the asteroid or like comet impact, and not because of the shift.
I don't exclude the idea of impacts. I've kind of arrived at a place where I think that this cycle is somehow connected to the greater cycles of our solar system. The planets all move around on a pretty regular clockwork, which does shift over time, but in the scales of time that we're talking about, it seems to me that these cycles are tied together. So if we consider the Taurid meteor shower, it appears to have it appears to be perhaps the remnant of another body that was destroyed in our solar system. It was orbiting as well, and maybe it had an interaction with Jupiter or something like that in the past. And I bring that up because I think that perhaps we have impact events that occur on a similar cyclical time frame to these decoupling events. I think they may be related, and that would explain why we have many accounts of both of things of fire in the sky or fire coming from the sky, aligned with these cataclysms as well. Very often the two are described together: water from below and fire from above.
Mm.
So I think there may be a resonance there that that could it's a confounding factor because we try to pin it on one thing or the other, and try and attribute causality between one and the other. They're not necessarily one is not necessarily the cause of the other, but they may occur at the same time or very
Mm.
close together.
So one of the things that I heard is that there's DNA that has been preserved in ice sheets and for a million years, and that's why it's not possible that or that the poles could have moved. Otherwise, the DNA wouldn't been preserved. What do you think about that?
Okay, well we don't have ice sheets that old. As far as I'm aware, I know that I think we're talking about a maximum of about 800,000 years in the cores that we have drilled. So millions of years is a stretch. There's one little patch of ice in Antarctica which is reported to be about 8 million years old. I wasn't aware of DNA being found therein, but I just don't know about that. So certainly a possibility if there is ice that old. I don't know whether that conclusively proves the Earth doesn't undergo any sort of major upsets. Not that I
Mm.
understand it to.
In one of your articles, you mentioned that you think that the maximum is 6,000 years, the ice sheets.
I don't know whether that was one of mine. You know, a lot of the material I publish is not written by me. Most of it is actually, I'm republishing primary sources in particular where I can find them. So there certainly may have been mention of that in there somewhere. It wouldn't have been my words.
Mm.
I don't think the ice is, I think we've got ice much, much older than that. I
Mm.
recently published a piece on X where they were reporting on 8 million-year-old ice from Antarctica.
Mm. So then it is possible, well, if there is ice, let's say millions of years, but how would that stay unmelted if the poles shift?
So, because the duration in the second state is, by all appearances, is not very long in geological terms. We're not talking about thousands of years or millions of years in state two. It's
Mm.
probably somewhere between 50 and 1,000 years is my guess at this time, which is just the blink of an eye. Not enough time for much signature to be left on the Earth, and not enough time for that massive ice in Antarctica to melt, not by far. That would take
Mm.
probably hundreds of thousands of years for that much ice to melt. And we have to consider that if this were to occur again, that massive ice now rotating around the equator is going to absorb enormous amounts of heat from the equatorial and tropical zones. It's going to get really, really cold everywhere. The locations that move to the poles, that become the new polar regions, are not going to be there very long either. But that would explain why we see some evidence of glaciation in places like Central Africa, because Central Africa spent a little bit of time at the northern geographic pole. So yeah, I don't think there's in Tez's model there's not enough time in the second state for the ice to melt entirely. There may be enough time for some of it to melt off, and the thing is that would be very difficult to spot that in the ice cores themselves. There are documented accounts of more than a dozen layers of ice being laid down in extremely stormy periods in the polar regions, which would be read as 10 years. Meanwhile, it was laid down in a year. It's because they basically count the layers in the ice to determine the age. And that discounts the possibility that there could be a compression in there that is unaccounted for. There
Mm.
could be
Yeah, yeah.
events record. There could be physical events recorded in those ice cores that the current paradigm just simply doesn't account for.
Yeah, I think that's the article was about, that the modern science says that each ice sheet is uh what, frozen annually every year, but
Yes,
it's not
yes,
necessarily true because different events could have caused several ice sheets per year, and that means
absolutely.
that, yeah, they're not that old. I think that's where I read that about 6,000. Maybe I
Yes,
remember.
yes, yeah, and yeah, I think that may have come out of World in Peril. Actually, I don't
Mm.
remember very clearly, but yes, very much so.
Okay, so then it
So,
is possible.
mhm.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say to should we just run this
Yeah.
through quickly just to see what ECDO and is expected, what Tez is proposing here. So this is
Hmm.
obviously our current rotation, and here we see. I'm just going to pause it there for a moment. So in this animation, this is not a physical model. This is my interpretation of Tez's description of what happens. And what I did here was I wanted to try and approximate what I thought the mass of water might do if the land mass reoriented itself. So we have all of the oceans traveling at the equator from west to east at over 1,000, I think it's 1,600 kilometers per hour. Obviously, we don't experience this because the land, the air, and the water are all moving together. But if the land were to take a different path, the water is going to continue traversing from west to east. So these little white hairs that I've put on here are just to provide a reference for where the water might pass over the land. Whoops, let's go back there, sorry. Why that didn't play. Back to there. Okay, here we can see as the Earth's crust reorients, the water, wherever the little hairs pass onto the land, would be where we would be seeing massive inundation of the land. And now we're in the second state. I don't know why that's misbehaving. Sorry. Technology. And in the second state, we can now see how the polar regions have moved towards the equator. And in this state now, that second shaft on the pyramid would be pointing towards the new North Pole, providing a measure to anticipate when the return to state 1 occurs. And here we go back again. So that period is expected to be 550 to 1,000 years maybe. And then we're back to where we are.
So then one
Okay.
event happens, it's a big cataclysm, and then when it goes back, it's another cataclysm.
Absolutely. And we have found a few accounts that kind of seem to describe this. One was Emanuel Velikovsky's account of the destruction of Crete, where he described an account of the inundation of Crete from the north, which is currently believed to be the result of, I think it was Santorini volcano erupting in that region, causing a tsunami. And then he goes on to talk about how the civilization had just gotten themselves set up again, and about 50 years later, something happened again, and that wasn't described necessarily as an inundation. It sounds as though it was earthquakes and volcanism. And that would make sense because after the first rotation, the Mediterranean would have lost a great deal of its water over the Sahara. So it's unlikely that Crete would have been flooded the second time, but certainly on that return, there would once again be massive amounts of volcanism and seismic activity that would have just torn it all down again. And that is what seems to have been recorded there. There are a number of other accounts we've come across that seem to describe two events within a lifetime, quite literally. So there's some written evidence of this, but the period that we're talking about is so brief that it wouldn't be recorded in most of the geological records. There's one example where it seems we may have a record of that, and that is let's bring that up here. We have to pull the slide up. This is a record of magnetic reversals from the Younger Dryas period, from the beginning of the Younger Dryas. And these come from a set of what are referred to as clay valves. And clay is often laid down in annual layers according to the season. There's a wet season and a dry season. And within the clay is also recorded the magnetic orientation of the Earth at the time. And in this sequence here, now most people have the idea that that magnetic excursions in particular, or we'll say we should probably differentiate between magnetic reversals indicate a complete reversal of the Earth's magnetic field. And these are popularly considered to take thousands or even millions of years to actually occur. But the evidence suggests maybe quicker. Clay valves are quite special because they provide almost annual resolution. We can see the magnetic field from one year to the next, how it changed here. And this sequence that Nils Axel Morner discovered in this clay spans only 300 years. And in this 300 years, we can see that the magnetic field almost reversed, but in many cases went around about 100 and 120 or 80 degrees of reversal several times within a space of 300 years. So the physical evidence suggests that this can happen very rapidly, magnetic reversals, and it's also suggestive that what we see as purely magnetic reversals may also be attributed to reorientations of the Earth's crust. And as it reorients itself, so the magnetic field is obviously going to change relative to the crust because the most of the field originates from within the core.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So is there a cyclicity to this, or do
I
you think
think
it's just random?
I do think I I'm very very convinced that this is cyclic, um, but not consistently so. When I say not consistently so in terms of of the depth of the expression. Um, I think we see major cycles that are interleaved with lesser ones, but there's certainly seems to be a rhythm to this. Um, and from what I like to look at data, I like to look at the numbers as much as I can. I try to avoid too much speculation. I think that the Earth has a lot to offer us in terms of giving up what its history is, and it looks to me as though we definitely have a great cycle of around about 13,000 to 14,000 years, many could say 12,000 years, um, and that there are within that lesser cycles. The one I've seen most strikingly is around about 3,700, and the Crete event that I spoke of was 3,700 years ago. And the refilling of the Black Sea was another 3,700 years before that, as one other example of what we seem to see recorded. Uh, so yes, I think this is almost certainly cyclic, but the record is so fragmented; it's very difficult to put together a complete chronology. Um, Everything appears to have been shaken up so many times that we're hard pressed to find a single continuous record anywhere.
Mm. And you mentioned the pyramids, and do we actually see right now the North Pole from that right angle? Is it in the position right now? Did somebody go and
Well,
check?
it's currently in the right place, thankfully.
Well, it means
Uh,
it's coming. It means it's
no,
soon.
well, the poll is currently there, but the issue we have is that we don't have a very long record of the Earth's rotation. We've been recording it quite precisely for about since the satellite record began. So for the last 30 years or so, we have a very good handle on the Earth's rotation, but 30 years is nothing in the time scales that we're talking about. So we don't have if we had 1,000 years of the Earth's rotation to look at, we could probably say for sure, yes, things are not looking right at the moment. But we don't have that. We only have this brief little window to look at. So even within that brief little window, we over the last 30 years, we're seeing things in the Earth's rotation that have not been seen in the earlier parts of it. Um, a lot of what's happening with the rotation right now is completely new. Um, it's the wobble seems to when I say it seems to be tightening at the moment. If you can imagine this rotation is getting a little bit tighter, and that to me is a concern because my thinking is that when it reaches that point of near stability is when there's a tipping point. And that is when, as we saw with those demonstrations of the gyroscopes earlier, it's after that point of near stability that the real destabilization happens. And that could be within months or years, I think, after that point, if we get there.
What is your like? Do you have a number?
I don't like to put a number. Um, I'm my greatest period of concern is starting from about 2030, and
2030.
yeah, yeah. Um, I have that is largely based in my feelings about the rhythms of the planets in the solar system, and that we are approaching a point of gravitational almost equilibrium. Every so often, the four great outer planets they don't align, but they place themselves in positions of opposition around the sun, where they balance each other out. All of the tugs of Jupiter, Uranus, Neptune, and Saturn kind of negate one another, and these periods have been connected by various other researchers over the years. Thinking about Theodore Landsheet is a name that comes to mind, a man whose work I quite appreciate. He predicted that these gravitational cycles were connected to grand solar minimums, to great climatic shifts, and he presented pretty convincing work on that, demonstrating that when the sun is undergoing the least amount of gravitational stress from the outer planets, and there's certain sequences of this when we seem to be plunged into periods of extreme cold, increased seismic activity, plagues, epidemics, pandemics, you know, you name it. So yes, I think we have I think we have a period of concern coming up that fits that model.
So
Um,
as soon as we are already in solar minima or not yet?
where well, Lunsky proposed that this next grand solar minimum is going to begin in 2030, and that
Oh.
it would we're about to have a visitor again, and that it would continue until 2070 was the window that he placed upon it.
Mm.
Now he wasn't a catastrophist in the traditional sense, but he certainly made this observation about historic solar minimums being somehow tied to the movements of the planets.
And that's associated with weak magnetic field as well.
It does seem to be associated with the weak magnetic field, yes, and that is a concern as well, because as field weakens, so obviously we enjoy far less protection from the ravages of outer space, ionized radiation, charged particles, all reaching us here on the surface, which are which obviously can be devastating to life, but it can also produce new life. And this may be the explanation for the why the geological record seems to demonstrate very often the emergence of even more species than those that go extinct in the same period. Suddenly, a whole variety of new life appears at the same time as the extinction.
Mm.
So that is very likely, and it's definitely not my idea. This has come from many authors before who theorized that this emergence of new life during these events is due to this weakening of the magnetic field and the increased levels of radiation on the surface, which basically mutate genes and produce new life.
Hmm. So what is obviously pyramids? Apparently, the ancient civilizations knew about this, and they seem to be very much advanced. If they could, I mean, if you compare what general population knows about these
Mm, mm,
cataclysms and what they knew about, there's a big difference, right? I mean, obviously, I'm sure like elites know a lot, but the normal people, we don't know much about it. So I mean, have you ever like thought about like how did they know? Have you looked into it, like the ancient
mm.
civilizations?
I've given it quite a bit of thought, and when we say advanced,
In a
I'm
different direction.
Yeah, in a different direction. We cannot paint the picture of technological advancement that we know today upon ancient times. Um, what I see in these ancient structures is an indication that they watched the sun and the stars and the moon, and through observation over periods of years and lifetimes, they accumulated um, relationships between what they saw in the sky and what was happening on the ground. And clearly, there had been passed down from generation to generation the idea that these events had happened in the past and that there were certain celestial events that seemed to accompany them. So it's not it's not too difficult to imagine how somebody living in a place for several years would start to mark the locations that the stars rose and set at various times of the year on the horizon, and might even set up markers to track this. And it's even conceivable that that it would be seen that at some point, hey, the sun's not rising in quite the right place. Something has been upset. So it really could just take a couple of sticks in the ground or a few very heavy rocks that aren't going to move to make sure that you have a consistent point of observation to track this. So advanced from the point of view that they paid attention to the world around them, which we don't do very much today. They looked
Hmm.
up,
Hmm.
if I can put it that way.
So this pyramids you just mentioned that they are directed into the North Pole. Like I think Stonehenge, Randall Carlson talked about it in his channel. How it also was directed. The solar. I forgot what it's called. And then there was in Latin America. There's in China the pyramids, and
They're
also
everywhere.
yeah. So it's like we have, let's say, what do we have? We have alarm systems, right? Like we have uh, like clocks, we have computers, I mean, all over the world that we use to see things or observe things. But they had those pyramids, they had those structures. So it's kind of like the same methods that we have, but different things.
Yes.
Uh, what is your when we look at this, for example, Göbekli Tepe, how it has been, I think, oh, I keep forgetting his name, Jimmy, I forgot. Anyway, so
Oh, Corsetti, Jimmy
yes,
Corsetti.
yes,
Yes.
he talks about how olive trees were planted there, is like as if they were trying to destroy the place. So, what do you think? What's happening with? Why do we not know the truth? What are these? Why we're not trying to find out? What do you think?
Um, I think that it's a method, it's a mechanism of control. If there are 8 billion of us on this planet today, what would be the outcome if it was common knowledge that the Earth underwent major resets every few thousand years? Uh, so I largely think that that this has been kept quiet in order to elevate the position of those who know, to give them control. Uh, and because without, if this knowledge was widely known, it and it was accepted as fact, as I think it was. I'm sure this was taught to children as a fact hundreds, thousands of years ago. And this is why multiple generations would spend time building structures uh,
Mm,
to look for it.
that's
Um,
true. Yeah.
it was common knowledge, and then at some point, which may have been 2,000 years ago, there was a shift, and the evidence started disappearing, being destroyed, and that has continued to this day. We consider the looting of the museum in Baghdad. Um,
Mm.
that wasn't so long ago, and that happened right under the noses of the U.S. military, who was standing outside the gate. They did nothing to stop it. So, and then GT Göbekli Tepe is another perfect example. Why are we not digging these things up instead of covering them? The the removal of whatever was in the Great Pyramid before anybody else got to see, because there was definitely something in there that was no longer there as soon as it became publicly known. And I'm fairly sure that artifacts have been removed, hidden, destroyed, probably sitting in private collections that provide all of the answers to this.
Mm.
But they are, yeah, it's not convenient to those in power
Isn't
for
it
that to happen.
interesting how all these ancient structures, myth, and texts, everything seems to be, like screaming at us about
Mm-hmm.
something, and then yet
Yes,
we have no clue.
yes, absolutely right. Yes, and that interestingly was the tagline of a website which is now defunct. It was called An Apocalyptic Synthesis. The site was amalula.org. The author unfortunately died a few years ago. But that was exactly the tagline. The ancients are screaming at us, and you know, I think we're starting to listen. Um,
Mhm.
I feel quite positive about that. We probably could never have been sitting having this conversation even 5 years ago without it being completely ridiculed. But particularly with the recent work by the ethical skeptic, that has brought a lot of focus to bear,
Mm.
and has provided a very specific model which can be tested, and that is the key. And that is why I really, really like that hypothesis. It provides a testable bed, and as I'm sure you know, I've been looking in many, many places over the last year to see whether there is any evidence out there to back it up, and there's more than I can even start to publish. So
Can
yeah.
can you mention some of the most, like, the strongest ones?
Hmm. In terms of supporting evidence, well, shall we say the in the immediate time, we look at the migration of the magnetic pole and the weakening of the field. That is right in our face. And it strikes me as very peculiar that this is not getting more attention in the mainstream science or media. This is not something that happens every day. We have no direct records of it happening in the past. Obviously, we have proxy records indicating that things like magnetic pole shifts and field weakenings have occurred in the distant past. The most recent being a few thousand years ago, but we have nothing like that in recent memory. So to ignore what is currently happening with the field is, to me, a grievous oversight, and is a sure sign to me that they don't want attention drawn to that. And when something is being actively ignored or hidden is exactly when my ears start pricking up and my nose starts twitching. Why are we not giving this consideration
But isn't it like deliberately they stopped publishing about it?
about the pole movement?
Magnetic field, the strength of the magnetic field.
That data is still published.
Okay.
It is the global magnetic field is it's that report is updated on, I think, every 5 years or so. But and the same thing is essentially going for the magnetic pole. The public data is only updated on a fairly slow cycle. Um, Whereas the Earth's rotation, however, that is updated almost daily. There's public data available for that, so we we do have access to some real-time information at the moment, which gives us some idea. And we have a few citizen scientists out there who are trying to set up projects to, for example, track the magnetic pole independently. So
Hmm.
we're not flying completely blind at this
What
point.
are what are some of the what should we look out for? Can an like average person check for themselves, and where do we look at? What are the some indications?
I think we're going to see deepening climate disruption, um, particularly increased precipitation, and that is possibly connected to the weakening of the field because as the field weakens, so more and more listen to me getting my tongue tied, charged particles reach the atmosphere, and a gentleman by the name of Henrik Svensmark published, I think, a paper in the late 90s where he theorized that this increase in charged particles hitting the atmosphere was a foundation upon which cloud formation could occur, and periods of weakened field would lead to periods of increased precipitations. And so, to me, that's one key thing to look out for is increased rainfall. And Uh, it's anecdotal because the data is not readily available, but it looks as though we are seeing a lot of flooding in many places around the world over the last few years, which ties that in for me. The other thing that would happen with a weakening field is the migration of aurora closer to the tropics, and we have seen aurora closer to the equator in the last few years than has ever been observed in recent recorded history. Just the last couple of years. Uh, Increased seismic activity, definitely. Um, Increased volcanism, which also seems to be happening anecdotally. And that's another one which is very difficult to get good real-time data on, even though it looks as though we're seeing a vast increase in volcanism around the world. It's not being reflected in the official sources. Um, they're not showing it at all. Um, what else might we look out for? Uh, Behavioral changes in animals. I think Ben Davidson published or mentioned a paper just the other day on on bird migration changes, shifts which are occurring, birds winding up in the wrong places, a sure sign that their navigation systems are being disturbed. So yeah, I think there's quite a few things that we can look for to go a little bit more off the direct obvious track. People's behavior. Um, Russian scientist Alexander Chizevsky, about a century ago, I think, started looking um, at relationships between solar cycles and therefore obviously electromagnetic environment and the behavior of people and disease and wars and strife. And he found what appeared to be pretty strong relationships between solar activity and all of these factors. In things like heart attacks, um, he had access to a vast tranche of Russian medical data due to his relatively elevated status in Russia at the time. And he found relationships between solar flares and heart attacks, for example, noting that hospital admissions and heart attacks seemed to increase by about 400% in the day before and the day after a major flare. So there's a lot to suggest there's things we can look for around us. Um,
Mm-hmm.
People behaving strangely as well in mass is possibly a sign of an environmental change.
Mm.
I'm I'm much more inclined to go with environmental stresses as causes of both mental and physical disease, for example, than I am for viruses.
Mm. Yeah.
Mhm.
And what do you think about the next solar event? And could it cause something like Carrington event that happened?
Yeah, I
Because
do
I
think so.
think, isn't it gonna be like solar minimum, which means there shouldn't be much of a solar thing going on? So
Hmm.
how would that happen then?
Okay, so It seems that the Earth's magnetic field is very intimately tied to the sun's, and as the sun weakens, so too the Earth's field is weakening. I'm fairly sure that the two are linked together. And when we say grand solar minimum, so we have the approximately 11-year solar cycle, which many are familiar with, which manifests most obviously as El Nino, La Nina climate cycles and various changes around the world. Um, but there are also much longer cycles of solar activity. So even though we have this shorter cycle of 11 years, it is a subset, and we're currently very close to the top of the current 11-year cycle. But this will approach its minimum in 2030, is when that's likely to occur, when the sun reaches the bottom, which means we're probably going to see an even more dramatic weakening of the Earth's field heading towards 2030. I think it's going to continue down. I have a suspicion that at a point the 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 field reaches a very, very weak point, and there may be a pop from the sun. There may be. It doesn't even need to. If the fields are extremely weak at the time, as we've seen in recent times, it doesn't take a big flare to cause a big disturbance on the Earth. Uh, the M flare, the M8, I think it was, that happened a few days ago, a week ago, um, created huge geomagnetic disturbances here on Earth. I think we hit an 8 on the scale of 9 on the KP scale, um, which is extraordinary for what wasn't even an X flare. So yeah, I think we're in a highly vulnerable state, and it's becoming more so. And even a small, relatively small solar flare could do serious damage.
Hmm.
It wouldn't have to be a monster if we're at an extremely weak point.
Okay.
Yeah, hit us when
Um,
we're down.
Going back to the pyramids, what do you think? I mean, it couldn't been just the observation place. Do you think there was more to it?
Hmm. Well, when we talk about the Great Pyramid, I have a suspicion that that particular structure predates all of the others, probably by quite a long time. It's built in a different way, it's built with different materials, and it has a radically different interior design. So, in terms of that, I consider probably most of the other pyramids are just they're cheap copies um, that were built with different purposes. Definitely, some of them were built as tombs, I'm sure, but the original, I don't think so. I think that was its intended purpose. It was built as an observatory to monitor for these destabilizations, uh, so that the Egyptian civilization of the time could make preparation and retreat, probably to the Valley of the Kings and places like that, which also appears to have been built as a massive bunker complex, places of safety.
Yeah,
So
I hear there are a lot of tunnels there.
it's an enormous complex. And Giza, yes, there are certainly vast underground spaces which have been which we don't haven't we haven't been made aware of. I'm pretty sure they're there. A lot of
What do you
these,
think? What do you think they were for? Were they
what
afraid of the
lies,
pyramids?
I think what lies below Giza may have been on the surface. Maybe it was buried
Mm.
in the last event. Um, and what we see now is just what remains exposed. So there's that possibility. There's also the possibility that being in the desert, where else are you going to go for refuge? You go down into the ground because there's no mountains to climb and build and climb into caves or anything like that. And if the Mediterranean is going to be coming and making a journey across the land there, the only place you might possibly find refuge would be below ground. So I suspect that a lot of these underground spaces such as seen in Turkey as well, were refuges from these events. Makes sense?
Yes. But it's just, how about the some theories that the Great Pyramid of Giza, they had some sort of that it is some sort of a technology.
I don't discount them, um, and given what looks like there may have been some technology inside the Great Pyramid, um, I don't discount the possibility that other technologies may have been employed as well in other structures. But in my thinking, I don't know whether it's so speculative. We don't have enough hard evidence to do anything other than speculate upon that. So I don't know. I don't see much utility in speculation at this point. I think that we have fairly limited time ahead, and we have to focus on what we can see and what we can actually maybe extrapolate from the evidence that we have. Um, unless something new comes to light to show that, for example, the pyramids were energy generators. But you know, it's nothing more than speculation at this point. There's we don't we Whatever technology was in there is long gone, and we don't have it to corroborate with.
Mm. And if you had, let's say, if you could choose one ancient structure to investigate other than the pyramids of Giza, where in which direction would you look?
Hmm. Oh, now there's a question. I would very much. I think South America contains a lot of very valuable, as yet uncovered uh, knowledge as well. Um, so I don't know whether there would be one particular structure, but definitely I would consider South America to be a first place to start that I would choose to go looking. Uh, Tiahuanaco, maybe. Tiahuanaco is quite a spectacular site. It's at nearly 13,000 feet above sea level. There are seahorses found in the deposits around there, suggesting that the ocean was somehow either at that altitude or the land was somehow 13,000 feet lower than it is now. Um, so I think that is a very interesting place, and I would go there.
Hmm. And you live in South Africa,
I do.
so are you not preparing then?
Um, if the ECDO model is correct, South Africa and Southern Africa are in a somewhat unique position because if the movement occurs as Tess has suggested it does, then Africa travels north during the rotation, during the anomalous rotation, which means that the only water that it has to deal with comes from the Mediterranean. There's enough water in the Mediterranean to inundate most of the Sahara, but there's not enough there to make its way all the way south. So Southern Africa seems to remain dry during that first movement. Um,
Really? Wow, it's very
yeah.
coastal, isn't it? It's right at the
So it's,
coast.
well, we've got a very warm, a very moderate climate here at the moment. So at this time, it's fine. But we once we wind up at the North Pole, because where I am ends up very close to the new North Pole, North Geographic Pole, after the first rotation.
Wait,
So
I'm just checking.
shall we?
So,
Shall I find the map?
no, wait,
Let me
like,
find
so
it.
if we, but it's just in Indian Ocean and South Atlantic Ocean. It's just right in the middle.
Hmm. So, shall we watch this? Let's just watch this little clip that I have up here at the moment. Okay, so
Yeah.
this is looking at North Africa to start with. And
Mm-hmm.
here we can see, I've put the pyramid here, so we've got an
Yep.
indication that these two little shafts indicate the angles of the air shafts, the King's Chamber.
Mm-hmm.
So we can see the one currently pointing to the north. If we let this play, Now we see at present the sun is rising in the east and setting in the west as it should. And here we go. We run northwards. The Mediterranean spills south onto the Sahara. Oh, let's run that again. How we lost Africa all of a sudden. See, misbehaving.
So in which direction is the tilt happening? To the
Okay, so
east?
as we're looking at this now, the tilt
Yeah.
is going to be towards the top, towards the north. So the camera is staying
Oh,
locked over North Africa, and as the Earth tilts, which you'll see in the upper right-hand corner, we're going to see how the water would travel south, and that's what that is what the little furry hairs indicate. So here we go. Now we're traveling northwards. The water is spilling southwards onto North Africa, and now we're in the second position. And now we can see the sun is rising in the west.
yeah.
And this is recorded in quite a number of Mediterranean accounts that there were times when the sun rose on the opposite side. And that's quite a specific point because it's not the same in every place on Earth. In some places, the sun
Yeah.
doesn't rise on the opposite side. It depends on where you are.
Mm.
Okay, so that's North Africa. So now if we have a quick look at Southern Africa, we see the same thing happening
Yeah.
again. We're going to look at the same movement. And we've got these water bodies here. Obviously, these are a bit of a problem, but they're nowhere near the kind of devastation you're going to get from oceans. So
Mm.
you see, and there's the new North Pole now. That's the new North Geographic Pole right
Yeah.
there.
North. But isn't it going to be super cold then there?
Well, remembering, of course, that most of the ice has now relocated to the equator. So yes, it's going to get colder up here very quickly because of the lower solar input. But at the same time, there isn't going to be a vast mass of ice to start with. So it would take it would take years, decades for ice to start building up here. And
Mm.
my feeling is that when this happens, there's going to be so much volcanic ash in the atmosphere from the seismic disruption and all of the volcanism that we're pretty much going to not see the sun for a while, at least afterwards, due to the amount of debris that's going to be thrown up into the atmosphere. So I imagine that we probably will see the temperature become quite normalized across the planet. It will probably, in the equatorial regions that get shoved to the poles, will probably drop by 10 or 15 degrees. And the equatorial regions, I mean, sorry, yeah, and the equatorial regions will probably encounter something quite similar, because of all of the ice that's there. So I think the whole
Mm.
place becomes pretty miserable and cold for a while.
Similar.
Yeah.
Okay. Can we look at Europe on this map?
Oh, yes, for sure. I have the Mediterranean in Europe here. Okay, we'll run this again. We can actually look at a number of these if you want. I've got all of them here. Okay, and here you can see, here we go, the North Sea coming across Europe and probably spilling all the way through in many places back into the Mediterranean.
Right. So does that mean the whole Europe is going to be underwater?
It looks that way. It does look like most of Europe. Um, I'll pull up, yeah, yeah, I think that's. We looked at, but there's an interesting thing here. Many of the longest inhabited cities on Earth are in this region, around the
Mid-
northern rim of the Mediterranean and in the Levant, down the eastern side of the Med. Are, but we're only talking cities that have been continuously inhabited for a couple of thousand years at most here. So even it's not a very long time since they were wiped out. Now, I'd like to just pull up a map that I published on X just today. If I can find it here, I can drop it in. I'm just looking at all of my lost bits and pieces here. There it is. Hopefully, I can just drop it in here. put it there. Okay, so this is a map that was published in 1981. It was part of a paper by a gentleman by the name of Woodmarop. And what he had done is he had mapped all of the Earth's geologic provinces, there's of which there are currently accepted to be 10 of them, which are stacked one upon on top of the other. And what he came up with upon mapping all of these 10 layers of the Earth was that they're missing in most places. And this map shows, where I've highlighted in red, the only places on Earth where all 10 of the Earth's geologic provinces exist in sequence.
Mm-hmm.
Everywhere else, there are pieces missing.
Yeah.
So the reason I brought this up is because this map is not a regular map. He moved all of the pieces around for the purpose of just trying to get it all close together so it could be seen. But we can see here the northern portion of the Mediterranean is where these little white areas are where some of these complete sequences are in existence. So it would appear that these areas are not, probably
Affected.
don't see, they're not affected by the water, most
Interesting.
specifically, because it is the water which scours the previous layers away. So
Mm.
I think there's a few tiny little spots here and there that, for various reasons of local geography or the speed of the water that moves through there, that they don't become stripped too
Mm-hmm.
badly or
Yeah.
not at all.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
so
I
there's
read your article. I read your text today. So there was very small areas, patches on Earth that have all layers, all
absolutely
component
less than
layers,
1%, less than
less than
1% of the
1%.
surface.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and what you're saying is in the Mediterranean or in other parts of the world, there is actually pieces where have the records of all layers, which means
yes.
that most likely those areas might not be affected by the flood.
Well, they will
Interesting.
be affected, yes, because there will be this rotation. If it were to happen in, say, 24 hours, even then, in places we are going to see water moving over the land at supersonic speeds, depending on on where it is. And in the same way, there would be supersonic wind, because
Mm,
the atmosphere and the water are not going to care very much about what the land is doing below them.
mm.
Hmm. So,
Interesting, but those
so I
areas
would,
maybe they're
yeah.
protected by. Why do you think is not those areas do have the layers? What is, because it looks like the water will be coming anyways from the north.
Mm-hmm. So, in the case of the Mediterranean, I think that a lot of the water energy has been expended as it traverses Europe by the time it reaches the Mediterranean.
Oh.
So, it definitely does scour. Wherever we see black is where the layers have been taken before. They've been removed. So there would be some water that traverses through between the mountainous regions, but there's a few little areas here, Italy in particular, looking quite favorable. But I would never consider this to be an indicator of safe places.
Yeah,
This
yeah.
just shows us where maybe the water has not managed to scour anything away. And it's very interesting to see that around Indonesia and Sulawesi in particular here, which is very close to the point of rotation where we anticipate there wouldn't be much water velocity, even though it is an island area. The water velocities here would be negligible.
Mm,
And so this map is in very good agreement with what we see in the ecto hypothesis in terms of the rotation. Actually,
mm.
most of the geological data that I have uncovered over the last year, unfortunately, supports it.
What do you think about the sloshback effect?
The SAISH, uh, we've all seen it in a bathtub, or less commonly in swimming pools when the after an earthquake, the energy of the water returning is enormous, and this is probably quite well known with tsunamis as well. The initial inundation is not where the most damage occurs. It's when that water returns, when it turns back on itself and wants to reach the low ground again. It turns into a breaking wave as it comes back over the water that's been laid down. So you can imagine a tsunami comes onto the land, and then as the water starts returning back downhill towards the sea, it's coming back over this water which has already come in, and that is a devastating wave. That is what really does the damage, is the water coming back. So on a global scale, a SAISH, as it's termed, would be trans global. We would see water returning from across between continents, and that might come back days. It would probably be 12, 24, 36, 48 hours after the initial rotation. There would be the return of waters from the other side of the world, basically, in various places. Um, it and this provides a good explanation for the layers of deposition we see in places like Arizona, the Grand Canyon, where we have these vast plains of sediment which are all horizontal and have all clearly been laid down at the same time, stacked one on top of the other. And that, I believe, is largely due to the seismic activity, as the oceans returned again and again several times after the disruption, every time laying down another layer.
Yeah. Yeah, as you mentioned in the bathtub as well, it doesn't just stop, does it? It just goes
Mm-hmm. No,
back
no,
and
the
forth.
water would take days, weeks to settle. Definitely,
Mm.
it's a lot of energy to be settled after this.
Right. So we need to build Noah's Ark.
We do.
Okay.
I really think that we have the ability and the capabilities to make preparation for this. The reason that I've been talking about this so much now is because I think that if enough people can start paying attention, that the wheels will start to turn, beyond just saving the ultra wealthy. They certainly seem to be making plans. Um, so yeah, I, I really hope that this kind of work does produce exactly that result. That it becomes opened up to the extent that we can see broader public efforts to make preparation, even if it
Mm.
weren't to happen in our lifetime, for the sake of our children and grandchildren. That just to have that peace of mind that we are prepared. Um, I think
Yeah.
I think would be a great thing, and it would save us having to be reset back to the Stone Age once again, and then have to wait another 3,000 years before we crawl out of that.
Yeah.
Go put it that way.
Well, I mean, I'm not very optimistic seeing how even the ancient civilizations who seem to build these megalithic structures kind of perished. Um,
Mm, mm,
how can we, right? I mean, I think that we can prepare, for after, like I can see myself how, okay, so we need how we can grow food, or how you can, you know, do take care of, I don't know, water resources. I mean, those things
mm,
you can learn and prepare, because we know how before us people survived the wars, the different climate, you know, droughts and so on. So we know
mm,
there are
mm,
books you can study and learn, you can practice, have a farm. But how are you gonna but it's absolutely, right now it seems impossible to pr- to pr- I don't know, prepare for the inundation, because as you
mm,
said, the
mm.
water will be coming from everywhere.
Yes.
So what are you going to do? Where are you going to go? It
Mm,
seems impossible. What do you think about that?
yeah.
Are you preparing? But I mean, even in South Africa, Like there should be water coming anyways from
Oh
everywhere.
yes, yes, yes. There would be from on the return from state two to state one. Southern Africa is almost entirely inundated. Uh, there's a lot. There's enough evidence to show that as well. So in terms of preparation, for me, the first step of preparation is spiritual. Really, is preparing myself, and then beyond that is to start learning about the geography and history of the place where I live, to see whether I should maybe be relocating myself to somewhere that might provide a better opportunity should the time come. Um, Not that I feel I have to do that. Um, I think it's quite important that there are people all over the world when this happens, because historically what seems to have happened is that there there are numerous pockets of survival everywhere. Uh, and this is borne out by the insane number of flood myths which we find in every place on Earth, all relating very similar stories. Either they hung onto some logs, or they built a raft, they or they were lucky enough to find a mountaintop that they could take refuge on. But those it's always seemed to have been these very isolated groups who then believed they were the last living people on Earth after that.
Mm.
Um, so, but when we consider how much resource we can manage to throw at killing each other, for example, with war, imagine if some of that was diverted towards this kind of preparation.
Yeah.
Instead of building tanks, we started building infrastructure, such as
Mm.
what Japan has been investing in. Japan has invested more heavily into catastrophic preparation than any country on earth, um, and that's just purely on the basis that they're in a highly volatile place. Um, they're constantly having to worry about earthquakes and tsunamis, and so they've prepared for it. And Japan is a perfect example that that's completely viable to do this. Where there's a will, there's a way. But what we have
Yeah,
to
but
clearly
they
do
are
is
doing it. They are
mm,
preparing, right? They're
they
building.
are,
I mean, they're.
yes,
I think the reports come from, I think, construction who worked in constructions, some startups who were they had to come up with some sort of what is it called, like drones for underground cities. So there are
mm,
some stories that we hear that they're building underground cities and they're preparing, but it's just not for the general public. It's just for
mm,
that pocket, rich
uh,
pockets. So,
absolutely. Well, I have a feeling that the scale of subterranean construction is so great that it may be that maybe there's enough space already present for maybe 500 million people. And it, if I was making this, putting this strategy together, I would probably be saying, well, obviously we need to retain some amount of humanity as well in order to be able to restart. So it wouldn't surprise me if once that key moment has been observed and the destabilization is clearly happening, that a number of people suddenly are disappeared, whisked away to safe places, who are considered of value to the future society. I think they've possibly built sufficient accommodation for quite a number of people that don't even know that they're going to be taken yet for that
mm,
purpose. Yeah.
interesting. Okay, I haven't thought
Um,
about that. Okay, so they're
but
building, but yeah, it's an ethical question then. Like, who, if you make it
who do you
public,
choose?
who do you choose exactly? And you're gonna
Mm.
leave people behind? Like, probably
And
majority of
how
people will be left
and how do
behind.
you
This,
try and avoid the chaos when it
exactly.
comes to the time and it becomes apparent that people are being chosen?
Mm, yeah.
What's the most practical solution is to try and reduce the numbers to start with
Yeah, but
beforehand.
also, would you want to be chosen? Because how would you know what's going to happen there? Like, what are they
Yeah,
planning for those chosen people? What the
yeah.
offsprings? Like, what is the plan? Have you seen? There's like a TV show, Silo. I think it's called, or
I've
Silo.
watched it. I've
Have
watched
you?
it, yes.
Yeah, my
Mm,
favorite. But I think it could happen. Something like that could happen, where you have no idea,
absolutely.
and then there's this engineer who sits and watches the window, and then thinks that he figures out that we're rotating, but they have no
Mm,
idea
mm.
that we are on planet Earth.
Yeah, there's a string of there's Greenland recently, the movie Greenland, the movie 2012, going back a while, which
Mm,
all bring this idea through. Don't Look Up, I think more recently on Netflix
yeah.
as well. Um, that yes, that they would choose the select cream that they wanted to
Mm,
retain. Um, and from a looking at it at a purely at a purely functional sort of level, I don't personally see any other possible route that could really be taken. I don't think it's technically viable to try and save the entire population of the planet. Um, so maybe it's the only option. Um, if we look at it, if we really look at it hard, you know, is there any other way? I don't
it's
think so.
just there seem to be very advanced technologies available to certain groups. And
Mm,
knowing what kind of technologies those are, I mean, obviously I can't prove, but having heard from multiple people, I think if you have access to those kind of things, technologies and energy sources,
mm,
um, it's not difficult to think that you might be able to save. But then obviously, of course, it's this knowing how there seems to be like a malicious behavior. So I wouldn't
mm.
expect much.
Yeah, yeah, no, and I think that sense of malice comes from what I alluded to just now. That I think there is a technical limit on how much infrastructure they can build. They've been certainly working on it for a long time, maybe 100 years. They've been preparing for this, and in that 100 years, perhaps they've built sufficient infrastructure to house a 500 million people. So the idea of I don't see how it would be physically possible to provide sufficient infrastructure for 8 billion people um, in the next 5 years, which is maybe it may be the window that we have, but maybe it's in the next 50 years. Maybe in the next 50 years there would be sufficient infrastructure in place to take most of the planet's population. Um, I always found Musk's boring company quite an interesting little sideline for him. Yeah, everything that he does seems to be geared towards preparation for
Really?
something like this. Yeah,
What company is that?
well, the Boring Company is a subterranean tunneling organizing company,
Ah, mm.
um, using some of the most advanced digging technology I think ever built. And yeah, so there's that escape to Mars or the Moon, um, and and
But
obviously
isn't
the
other
introduction of
planets?
AI.
Yeah, is
Mm.
other planets are also gonna have something like that, aren't they?
Well, this particular destabilization probably occurs on other planets, but I don't think it necessarily happened with
At the same
synchronous with the Earth at the
time.
same time. No, I think each would have its own rhythm,
Oh,
and
okay.
I do think that this requires a certain amount of dynamism to the mass of the planet. There has to be a movement or some kind of shift going on and within for it to occur on a regular
Mhm.
basis. Um, and yeah, it's quite interesting that, for example, I think Venus is rotating on its side. So We have some evidence in the planets around us. Some of them are rotating in the wrong direction. They're upside down. Some are sideways. That maybe they have been upset and had enough time. We need to be watching these things for a very long time, for hundreds of thousands of years, to observe a change like this happening somewhere else. And
Mm.
we haven't. We've only been looking at it for the last few decades, really. For the last 100 years have we had maybe the technology to see whether a planet that's distant from us is rotating any way differently than it was, say, 10 years before. Um,
So
so
hypothetically, it's possible to survive the event on a different planet.
I would say, yeah, I think hypothetically it is. And Mars is probably the best bet.
Right. So
By
before I
virtue of
cut
the
you,
fact, yeah, sure.
Mhm. No,
I
before
say
I
just by
cut you off,
virtue of it having water. Mm.
yeah, before I cut you off, you were gonna say about AI, how they're
Oh
building
yeah.
AI.
So the introduction of AI into the public sphere in recent times to me is a marker as well. AI has now that we know what kind of computing power is required to achieve it, it becomes quite obvious that even though that amount of power has only recently become commercially available to the public, it has been available in the form of supercomputing clusters and the likes
Yeah.
to governments and organizations with a lot of money for decades. They've had this tech for a lot longer than we've had it available. So I think one of the reasons, perhaps, for bringing it into the public sphere now is that AI's success is very much reliant upon its interaction with people as well in order for it to
Mhm.
learn. So they are strengthening it in preparation beforehand, and AI coupled with robotics will become the new workforce, which is precisely what will be needed to launch a new civilization in relatively short time. You have a whole lot of iRobots ready to go.
Mhm. Yeah,
Mm.
because you otherwise you're gonna have economic collapse if you don't have enough
Yes,
man force.
yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
So why do you think they released it to public to train their models?
Because to train their models, yes, I think that is the primary reason, not for our benefit.
No,
No.
but we can benefit while it's there.
We can,
Um,
we can make, and that's the double-edged sword we see in so many
yeah.
things, isn't it? Uh, is that it has to be put out there in order for it to be effective, but at the same time, it's being revealed. So yeah,
Mhm.
and personally, I certainly am doing, and I'm leveraging that tech as hard as I can to try and dig through this data and this information.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for all the work you're doing. I will link your website. Do you have like your own channel or do your
Um,
X, right? You're on X?
my ex account Nobulart Nobulart is definitely where I'm most active because it's where I get the most traction. So
Mhm.
yeah, that's where you can most easily find my work and me.